All right. so this isn't really completely philosophical. I wanted to talk about more not really a philosophical idea, but like a premise, um, which is happiness, right? So, would you consider yourself happy? A lot of people would say no and then explain, like the stress, the work, like breakups, depression, like, life in general. Some would say yes, but, I think a huge number of people would say, I don't know. Some days yes, some days no, because happiness isn't really constant. It changes day to day. Happiness, you need a definition for it. Happiness is usually defined as pleasure or contentment. And I believe that definition is misleading because pleasure can be temporary. You can be happy for an hour, watching a movie, playing a game, hang out with friends. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're happy with your life overall. I feel like happiness is an overall achievement. Um, and there's a big difference between being happy in a moment and being happy as a person. And real happiness isn't just about moments of pleasure, it's about how your life feels on a day to day basis. Um, and I think, happiness is built from like a jumble of small achievements that just like, pile up over time. It's not like one big thing, it's not one big reward, it's not like, here you go, you've achieved happiness. Happiness and, you know, that idea that it's slowly built, I feel like, also applies to purpose. Happiness and purpose are intertwined, because they kind of have that same central idea of like, you found a purpose which pleases you, and your purpose can also lead to happiness because you found something you're truly meant to do. You work towards goals, you feel like you're progressing, you have something to chase, you have something to do, you have a goal in mind, you have something to work towards, you have something to achieve, you have something to spend your energy, spend your time, spend your life on. And that's really what gives life meaning, having a chase for something. And without that, like a stress-filled life can pretty much feel empty. There's not really much, such thing as a stress-free life. Even if you're an entitled little kid who's, dad just like his trust fund millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars, you never need to work a day in your life. There's still obstacles along the way that you need to battle. Your own self-entitlement, your own attitude towards other people, how to fix yourself, how to carry yourself like, like a sophisticated individual. Like, just because you are given something doesn't mean you are given life stress free. That's just not a thing. And I don't know. It you you know if you're given more of something, I feel like the less stress you have, I feel like the more dissatisfied you are. Like it it's kind of like, you don't have something to strive towards, which is really, you need to strive to happiness, you need to strive for a purpose. And if you're in, that boredom of nothingness is just a pit of dissatisfaction. You're like, oh, I really wish I did this, oh, I really wish I did this, oh, I really wish I did this. It just piles and piles and piles and piles up. And another way to think about it is it's not just gaining pleasure, it's removing the things that make you unhappy. For example, money. People would say money equals happiness. Money doesn't completely equal happiness. It doesn't guarantee it in any way. It removes a lot of the stresses that create non-happiness, create unhappiness. Like, you got rent, you got food, you got, security, you got healthcare, you got all these day-to-day, month to month, year to year expenses that if you don't need to worry about, it'll technically, create more happiness in you because you have less induced stress. And humans are weird. Not weird. They're wired. They're wired to, chase the pleasure, but they also want to avoid pain at the same time. And that's kind of how our brains work. But the problem is if you rely, on the same kind of pleasure every single day, they lose their impact. What once felt good now becomes boring, and boredom is one of the fastest paths to unhappiness, because once you become bored, you're dissatisfied, you have nothing to strive for, and it just strips all your happiness away. It's like once you reach the top, people always say once you reach the top, you're greatness, but they also say once you're at the top, you're also alone, because you have nothing more to strive towards. You don't have a goal, you don't have this, you don't have that. Like, Michael Jordan's always praising, no, not Michael Jordan. LeBron James is always praising these other NBA players because he's striving to complete himself and still continue striving. He always talked about like Michael Jordan's 6 rings. He only has 4 or 5, whatever he has, right? He's striving to surpass that. He's striving to surpass something else. There's always a goal for him to achieve, right? When you're at the top of something, when you're at the top of the pyramid, when you're at the pinnacle of something, that creates, displeasurement. I don't know if that's a word, but it creates, it just creates that. You can't have pleasure in something that there's no reward to having it, if that makes sense. Um, which is why, the variety and the challenge and the pain matters, right? This is it's mainly why people love sports and they love video games, right? You're constantly achieving small, like eeny teeny little goals, scoring, winning, leveling up, improving, like, and the challenge gets harder and harder over time, but the reward stays meaningful. Even though you're doing the same thing, it feels rewarding because it's harder. Progression keeps pleasure alive, and this applies directly to real life. A lot of people assume having everything would make them happy, but it's almost most of the time not true. You see this with lottery winners or extremely wealthy people. When everything is handed to you at once, there's nothing left to chase. The joy comes from pursuit, not just the result. And the effort matters. The more effort you put into something, the better it feels when you achieve it. You work out every day, you eat well, you train hard, you do this, and you go D1, right? Next step, pro, or whatever you want to do. But that all that hard work is so satisfactory once you achieve it. And when the reward doesn't match the effort, it's like working hard at a job that pays poorly or feels meaningless. It's something like that. And that's why people become so deeply unhappy, because it it's like it's a reason why, like, people, I know I think I got a little off track there, but like I just like switch topics and I don't know. It's kind of like why people look down on 9 to 5s, right? You work at McDonald's, you make minimum wage, maybe a little more, but it's not the only satisfaction you get is that paycheck. You're not trying to achieve something with your job. You're not creating something. You're not, having technological advancements. You're not really helping people, right? You're feeding people, really bad food that's bad for them. I just said really bad. You're feeding people food that is bad for them. You're flipping burgers. You're dialing up orders in a calculator that does everything with you. There's nothing challenging about that. That's just no reward. And jobs that offer like visible progress, like small wins or creativity, are better than repetitive tasks with no sense of achievement. People enjoy feeling useful, capable, and challenged. That's why some people volunteer, to these hard places. They volunteer to, volunteer internship, like a non-paid internship, because they want to learn what it is like to be challenged. Happiness isn't just emotional. It's biological. Your brain rewards you for completing small tasks because historically that's what helped humans survive. Your brain says, food, good, please go kill the mammoth and cook the meat. It makes you feel replenished and gets you bigger and stronger. And even today, you're still wired the same way. You just live in a modern environment. You're still an animal, but you have the awareness. The awareness is powerful because it means you can understand your emotions and work with them instead of being controlled by them. One of the most important things humans do is sacrifice short-term comfort for long-term happiness. Doing something difficult now, school, work, discipline, because you understand it leads to a better future. That ability alone separates humans from most animals. Animals like are a lot of animals are lazy and they do things just to survive. They're not looking, they don't really have a long-term goal besides survival and the years that they have. But for a lot of people, long-term goals alone aren't enough. If your only reward is something 5 or 10 years away, life becomes exhausting. You need smaller goals along the way, like checkpoints, wins you can feel today, this week, or this month, maybe even next year. Otherwise, the finish line starts to just disappear and fade away and feel more impossible by the day. And that's why, doing something like writing things down work, breaking big tasks into smaller ones. It reduces stress and creates momentum. Every completed task gives you a small sense of accomplishment, and those small wins stack up and make life feel manageable. But balance matters. You can't turn productivity into an addiction. You need to rest. You need to enjoy yourself. The goal isn't to do everything, it's to do enough that your life feels purposeful without burning you out. And at the end of the day, happiness isn't one emotion or an achievement. It's a pattern, a loop of effort, progress, reward, rest, and connection. You're alive. The odds of that are insanely low. I'm pretty sure it's like you're 10 times more likely to win the lottery than to even be alive right now. So you already won the lottery, right? Spend time with the people you care about. Don't waste all your free time scrolling through things you won't ever remember. Do things that turn into memories, make your life a story, and make it a good one. That's what happiness is built off of. You can obviously nobody's perfect. People scroll, but you want to limit that, right? You want to slowly dim it down. You want to decrease your time limit. You want to decrease the time off your phone. It's good if you're scrolling and you're watching educational videos, but even that to a point becomes unhealthy for you because a lot of that information is incomprehensible, and you're just looking at blue light. You're looking at something that's bad for you. And I'm a victim of it too. I play video games, I scroll on TikTok, I do this, I do that, but it's slowly in my brain, it's slowly just melting down. When I was younger, I used to be on Xbox, every day after school, from 2 to 10 o'clock, 8 hours straight, barely had time with my family. Now it's more important to spend time with them. It's small realizations. You don't need to completely take and substitute something out of your life. It's about changing it for the better. And I think that's what true happiness is. You don't it's not about flipping your life upside down. It's tweaking it and maintaining it to where you truly feel productive, progressive, and complete. That is what I personally think the goal of happiness is.